we have to start being accountable as a part of our history and knowledge. And I'm not saying that everybody knew about that, but I'm sure it got around because we did have we even though we didn't have Facebook or Instagram or Twitter back back in the day, we did have Negro newspapers. We did have telegrams. We had family all around. So why was this hidden? And again, I think it was an idea to shield the pain that they experienced because they didn't want to relive it or talk about it, and they didn't want to burden us with that knowledge of that pain because so they wanted us to have hope. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that they didn't tell us, but we need to look at that and be honest about that too. You know, and I found a interview that Matt Ruff did, and he was asked why did he choose Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, to as his muse, if you will, as well for this book of short stories, because Lovecraft, and I'm going to talk about him, did science fiction, sci-fi. He had a lot of monsters. So when you watch the show and you see the grotesque monsters with the tentacles and all the eyes and the gruesomeness, that's Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft's MO when he wrote his short stories, the monsters and how they looked. Okay, and before I go to his quote, I'm going to share that the author was also, you know, agreed for Jordan Peele and Misha Green to produce and adapt his book for television, which he wanted to do it for television. And there were some people that were scared to do this powerful book on television for obvious reasons: racism, sexism, and so, well, not sexism, we'll get into that later. But he felt that based upon their work, they got what he was trying to do in a way that was more authentic than he imagined. And because he did not want to be judged with the term that they call white gaze, which is white people assessing or articulating, intellectualizing the Black experience, you know, which I still think that people such as himself are needed, because sometimes there are publishing houses that will not publish these types of stories from us. So, you know, again, when we talk about tapping into ancestral knowledge and getting beyond the decoding, we also have to look at there are ancestors in his line that may have felt that this story needed to come through him for whatever reasons. And he was quoted as saying, what's fascinating about Lovecraft's fiction is he had a very specific set of fears and dread, but he also tapped into this more universal sense of fear of people who are different from us, who have no mercy for us. So you can take a lot of his story ideas and plug in a Black protagonist, and it actually still works. And when I read that quote, I kind of was like, woo. But then when I looked at it, I said that, and we'll talk, like I said, talk about Lovecraft a little more, H.P. Lovecraft. But the idea that a lot of his literature was about fear of the unknown or other worldly things, and having no mercy to kill them. So what better way to flip it is to put those characters as Black protagonists who are dealing with monsters, have a universal fear of survival, as the heroes and heroines that are fighting these otherworldly things. So I think that was very impactful and genius. And I think that it also shows the magic of the idea that we can reproduce and give value to so many other things, just in general. And I think it was wonderfully done. And I guess you guys agree, right? So on to the next one. I'm going to try my best not to be long on here today, but I could talk about this forever. So H.P. Lovecraft. Now, H.P. Lovecraft was born in 1890 in New England, and he died in 1937. No. He died a little past that, but he was born in 1890. And he is considered the father of cosmic horror and sci-fi literature post-humorous. During his time, he was not viewed as a genius of horror. His literary contemporaries of his time considered his work pulp fiction and called him a hack. And if you don't know what pulp fiction is, it's just basically like just puffed up stories with extra adjectives and extra words, but has no real intellectual or literary value. I would say that it would be like, I guess, when people think of Tyler Perry plays. There are some people that feel that Tyler Perry's plays are not substantive, and he's a hack. So he was considered that by his peers during that time. But of course, years later, after he died, people revisited what he wrote. And just as a side note, Shakespeare was considered a hack during his time, and many of us have had to read several of his plays in high school and college. So I just find that very interesting, how people can view things and give value to certain things. Now, he was considered a cosmic nihilist. He was considered to be under cosmic nihilism, which is extreme skepticism in his writing, which his writing conveyed and aroused disgust, fear, and other cathartic negative emotions. Basically, he wrote some really dark, descending literature. None of his stories were very substantive in terms of hope or upliftment. And he was deemed a racist and a xenophobe, apologetically by some. And when I say that, people that like his work will lean to the side of, well, he was a victim of his time. To be racist or fearful of people, of Black people and immigrants or Jews, was something that it was cultural. So again, I think that it's very genius that Matt Ruff took this and flipped it. And then Jordan Peele and Misha Green flipped it even more to make it even give it more punch. And this is a quote that I found from one of his stories, because one of the things that he was known for was the monsters in his stories were considered dark. He used different adjectives to create them to mimic Black people, Asian people, immigrants, basically, because at that time there were a lot of people immigrating over to the United States. Of course, Black people were already here. There were still natives of this country. So a lot of his monsters were considered Black or other. And this is a quote that I pulled from one of his short stories, and it reads, "It would be too hideous if they knew that the one-time heiress of Riverside, the accursed Gorgon or Lamia, whose hateful crinkly coil of serpent hair must even now be brooding and twinning vampirically. Oh, I see what they're talking about. He was a hack around an artist's skeleton in a lime-packed grave beneath a charred foundation, was faintly, subtly, yet to the eyes of genius, unmistakably the scion of Zimbabwe's most primal grovelers." Pause. Wow, that's a lot, right? No wonder she owned a link with that old witch woman, for though in deceitfully slight propagation, Marceline was a negress. Medusa's Coil, 1931. So I'm gonna let y'all breathe on that for a minute. So again, as we start talking about the idea of Lovecraft and how powerful this is, and the ancestral knowledge that is being conveyed through the series, we need to look at the genesis of this. So the very idea that H.P. Lovecraft, the author, who this is the Lovecraft Country book was patterned off of, in terms of the monsters and the scariness and the magic, the very idea that Matt Ruff took that and flipped it on its head to examine racial inequalities and racial terror and juxtapose it next to the horrors of monsters and magic is genius. Would you agree? I think that some of you may see this as like, wow, this is like, I didn't even, did you know all of this? Let me ask you that. Anyone know this? Because, I didn't. I was just excited to see the show. But when I start feeling certain things and like, oh, wow, this is deep, I want to dig deeper. So before I even start these classes, I want you to understand the magic that is already begun before we even look at the layout of the series, and how your excitement and investment in this show is ancestral, your ancestral DNA being excited to see a certain level of education and knowledge. Are y'all still there? I want to be sure. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Now, if for all the apologetics of H.P. Lovecraft, this is a poem that I found that was written by him in 1921 on the creation of niggers. That's what it was written as. And it basically says, when, long ago, the gods created earth, in Jove's fair image, man was shaped at birth. The beasts for lesser parts were next designed, yet were they too remote from humankind to fill the gap and join the rest to men. Thy Olympian host conceived a clever plan, a beast that wrought in semi-human form, filled it with vice and called the thing a nigger. I'm gonna sit right there for a minute. So again, before we start getting into the whole aspect of the magic and the decoding and stuff and the ancestors and how we want to connect to that power, this is a part of the knowledge so you can understand how impactful the work that we're going to do means. You know, that to me was astounding. And of course, we can always talk about the idea that, you know, this was a part of the time, but this man's image is used as a bust, as the highest honor, I believe, for fantasy writing in 2020. Some people had wanted Octavia Butler's image to be changed as the bust, and he's still considered, you know, I'm just saying. So this is why the study of the series and itself is imperative that we do. It's not just a show that we watch like, oh, that was dope. No, that was medicine to our DNA, to our senses. It was activating for us. That's my opinion. And I guess you guys agree. So moving on. So recrafting Lovecraft Country for 2020. Now, of course, we know that Jordan Peele was the executive producer, and we know his work from Get Out and Us, and on television, The Twilight Zone. So we already know how Jordan Peele is able to do the horror genre and juxtapose it with social issues. So that alone. So we already knew, like I said, I was excited. Misha Green was the showrunner of Underground, which I love that show. I think it did 2 seasons on WGN and it was abruptly canceled. If you have Hulu or any other streaming service that may give you access to Underground, you really need to watch Underground. And Journey Smollett also starred in that series too. So it's very interesting to see the character that she played in Underground grown up in 1950s Chicago, in a sense. But I'm not going to get too deep into that, but just be mindful of these 2 geniuses coming together and the writing of it. One of the things that, if you look at the book versus the series, there were some changes that were made. One of them was that, it was a couple of changes that were made, but what they came together to do was to modernize it. And in the words of like what Matt Ruff shared, give it a more authenticity in terms of why Montrose was angry. And that's where we get into generational curses and generational trauma. You know, that was not a part of the book. Montrose struggled with sexual identity and acceptance. the abuse was lightly touched upon, but it was not fully explored as it is in the series, which a lot of us with our family, maybe our parents are a certain way. They're angry, they're bitter, they don't talk much because they have experienced certain levels of trauma. As Montrose experienced trauma from Tulsa, you know, his whole life changed in one day. He was already being abused for his sexual identification. Then he broke up with his male partner and then saw him killed before his eyes. And then a massacre occurred where he lost everything. He lost everything, including his family. So, and there's a lot of people that have that story. And a lot of that pain gets passed on, not just through the parenting, but through the DNA, like I shared. Another change that happened with the book into the series was Caleb and Christina. That was another storyline. But let's keep going to why we love the show so much.